The sun beat down like judgment from the heavens, flat and hot, with no breeze to stir the yellow dust that clung to boots, hems, and hopes alike. Rhett Coulter stood at the edge of his land, one hand resting on the bridle of a weary mare, the other curled loosely at his side like it had nowhere else to go. His limp had stiffened from a ride into town and back, and his jaw ached from being clenched too long, but it wasn't pain that hardened his features now. She was late, or maybe just unsure. When she finally appeared, she did so without ceremony, walking up the trail like a ghost might, silent, skin pale beneath the dirt, and posture too straight for someone who'd just been bartered. Willa Thorne wore a dark blue dress, faded and sun-bleached at the seams. She carried no bonnet, no luggage, but a cracked satchel with worn leather straps, and not a flicker of expression passed across her face as she stopped in front of Rhett. Behind her stood her mother-in-law, Martha Cale, arms folded, mouth drawn tight like a banker counting coins. She gave Rhett a look that said he'd better not ask questions, and then turned back toward her wagon without waiting for any parting word from the woman she'd just sold. "She's yours now," she said flatly. "Horse'll do." The mare snorted softly. Rhett nodded once, the trade done, and reached for the satchel, but Willa held it close. "I got it," she said, voice low and amused. He didn't press, just tipped his hat slightly and gestured toward the house in the distance, a squat structure with peeling paint and a porch that groaned in the wind. Willa didn't glance back at Martha, nor did Martha turn to see if she went. The wind picked up briefly as if to sweep the moment away, but the dust only settled heavier. They walked in silence toward the house, side by side, but not together. Rhett's limp made his steps uneven, and Willa adjusted hers to match without thinking. He noticed, said nothing. Inside, the air was cooler, smelled of cedar and iron, and the faint sweetness of dried lavender left in a dish near the window. Rhett motioned toward a small back room. "Yours if you want it," he said. "Clean sheets. I'll be out in the barn." Willa nodded. Her eyes had the look of someone who'd learned not to flinch, but never quite forgot how. She stepped into the room, left the door half open, and sat on the edge of the bed without untying her boots. Rhett watched her a moment longer than he meant to, then turned and walked out without a word. Outside, the sky had taken on that late afternoon haze, where everything glows but nothing feels warm. He busied himself feeding the animals, checking the fence line, pretending not to think about the girl inside his house who hadn't spoken more than 6 words to him. She hadn't cried, hadn't asked questions, hadn't said thank you. He didn't expect her to. By nightfall, the wind had cooled. He returned to the house with a plate of cornbread and stew, left it outside her door, then sat on the porch with a cup of strong black coffee and listened to the coyotes call across the hills. Her footsteps were soundless inside. He could have imagined the whole thing, if not for the second cup he'd left out on the table, still untouched. When dawn came, he found the stew gone, the plate washed and returned to the counter. She'd taken her time to wipe it clean, even though he hadn't asked. That morning, she followed him silently into the pasture. She kept her eyes low but her spine straight, helped mend fence slats without complaint. Nails crooked, hands clumsy, but determined. When her palm bled from a slip with the hammer, she wrapped it in her apron and kept going. He offered her no praise, just handed her a pair of gloves for the next post. By noon, he noticed the way her shoulders eased when no one shouted. She moved slower, not from weariness, but wariness lifting. That evening, the first whisper reached them. Tansy Bell rode up under pretense of delivering soap. She didn't get off her horse. "Didn't know you were in the business of taking in widows, Rhett." "I'm not," he said evenly. She leaned forward, eyes sharp. "Folks say she's trouble. That preacher she married died awful sudden. Body buried before morning." "Just sayin'." He didn't answer, just took the soap and turned back toward the house, leaving her to stew in her own dust. Willa watched from the window, face unreadable. But when Rhett walked in, he caught the way her fingers trembled slightly as she folded laundry. Not from fear, from memory. "They think I poisoned him," she said later that night, unprompted. She stood by the hearth, arms crossed. "They said I was a curse, a serpent in a dress." Rhett didn't turn from the fire. Did you? She hesitated. No. Then it don't matter what they say. Her laugh was short, dry. You say that like this town ever cared about the truth. He didn't argue. Just pulled an extra quilt from the cupboard and handed it to her. That for my warmth or your peace of mind? She asked. Both, he said. The wind howled that night. Somewhere distant, a barn door slammed. Willa sat up in bed, locket clutched beneath her blouse, and listened for footsteps that never came. She didn't sleep, but she didn't leave, either. In town, the gossip spread like spilled sugar. By the week's end, the whispers had twisted into stories. Some said she'd lit the match that burned down her husband's church. Others claimed she'd walked out of her marriage, bed, bloodied and laughing. No one asked her for her side. They never did. Rhett's name came up, too. Old rumors resurfaced, like weeds after rain. About how his wife fell from the orchard ridge. About how he stood to still the day they buried her. About how a man who talks soft might be hiding a scream. But none of it made him send Willa away. Instead, he fixed a porch swing that had sat broken for 4 years. On the 5th morning, Willa stood outside by the paddock fence. The air was thick with smoke from a neighbor's chimney, and the frost hadn't yet melted from the ground. She looked smaller in that light, like someone trying to shrink from a cold. They ever going to stop talking? She asked. Rhett leaned beside her, arms folded. No, but they might start forgetting. That worse. Sometimes, he said. Sometimes it's grace. She looked at him, then really looked at the gray in his beard, the way he never quite straightened his injured leg, the way his eyes stayed soft even when everything around him hardened. You don't ask much. I figure folks give what they got, he replied. She turned back to the paddock. I don't have much left. He let the silence settle like snow, then said, that ain't true. You're still here. She didn't answer, but she didn't walk away either. The horses chewed hay in the stillness between them. That night, Rhett left the lamp on in the hallway. Willa closed her bedroom door, but didn't latch it. In the dark, each of them breathed like they hadn't in a long time. Not in relief, not in fear, but in the quiet of knowing someone else was near. Some trades are made in coin and cattle, others in trust. And trust, out here, was the rarest thing of all. But something had passed between them now, something quieter than a promise, older than shame. And it waited, just barely visible, like light beneath a door that hadn't been opened yet. The first frost of October came before the sun, laying its silver breath across the fields. Willa woke before it melted, sitting up in the quiet room Rhett had given her, wrapped in that quilt stitched by someone's long-dead kindness. Her hands ached from the fence work, her ribs sore from a dream she didn't remember, only the feeling of it, running, hiding, hands gripping hers too tightly in the dark. She stood, stepped lightly to the window, and looked out. The ranch was a slow thing in the morning, like an old hymn building one verse at a time. Rhett was already out by the paddock, limp more visible in the cold. He moved with a kind of purpose that didn't ask anything from the sky or the earth. He simply did what needed doing. Willa watched for a moment longer, then pulled her coat around her shoulders and went to meet the day. They didn't speak much those mornings. She took to sweeping the porch, fetching water from the well, kneading dough with unsure hands while Rhett saw to the animals. It wasn't asked of her. He never once told her what to do. But she felt steadier when her hands had purpose, and Rhett never stopped her. One morning, he caught her chopping wood with a dull hatchet and a stiff wrist. You'll crack your hand before the log, he said. She turned toward him, hair loose from his tie. Is that what happened to you? She asked, nodding toward his limp. He didn't smile, but something gentler passed through his expression. No. Mine was a mine shaft up in Ruby Canyon. Took 6 men with it. Left me as the warning sign. She didn't reply. But the next morning, the hatchet had been sharpened, and her wrist was wrapped with cloth. Later that week, the cold rain came, soaking the soil and slowing the sky. Willa spent most of that day inside, sorting the root cellar, fixing the loose seams on Rhett's coat. She found an old photograph tucked into the coat's inner pocket, creased, faded. A woman with light hair and unreadable eyes. His wife. Gone now. Willa put it back without looking too long. That evening, she stood on the porch, watching the storm settle. Rhett joined her with a tin mug of something warm. He didn't offer it, just sipped quietly, watching the horizon. "Did she love you?" Willa asked, voice low. "Sometimes," he said. "I think she tried." Willa nodded like that answer made sense. "That's more than most get." He studied her then, not unkindly. "You don't talk about him." "Nothing worth repeating," she said. "Except maybe this. Preachers make good liars." They didn't speak for a while after that. Rain dripped from the roof, slow and steady like a clock trying to forget its purpose. At the general store 2 days later, the whispers followed them like flies. Tansy Bell leaned against a barrel of flour and didn't bother lowering her voice. "Wonder what he's paying her with now, since the horse is gone." Willa didn't flinch, just gathered the flour and sugar she'd come for, and walked out without a word. Rhett followed, jaw tight. "You don't have to come with me any more," she said once they were back in the wagon. "Don't mean I won't," he answered. She turned her face toward the wind then, and let it dry the salt on her cheeks before he could notice. The town's judgment wore different clothes each day: gossip, stares, awkward silence. But it all said the same thing. She didn't belong, and Rhett had made himself strange for letting her stay. She took to walking the orchard behind the barn at dusk, where the wind moved through the trees like voices too tired to accuse. Some of the trees still bore fruit, small and bitter, but living. That's how she felt. Still standing, still bitter, but alive. One evening, Rhett found her there, hands full of green apples, and her boots muddy from a creek bed. "You hungry or angry?" he asked. "Both," she said, biting into one. "Didn't know these were yours." "They're not. They're just here." She nodded like that meant something more than it did. "Town's colder than the frost," she said. "I knew they'd talk, but I didn't expect the way it still hurts." Rhett leaned against the fence post, arms crossed. "Hurts, 'cause you're still hoping they'll stop." She looked up sharply. "You don't." "I did. Then I stopped waiting for the echo to change." Willa dropped her gaze to the apple in her hand. "Sometimes I think I became the story they told. If you hear it enough, it sounds like truth." He took a step closer then. Not near enough to startle, just close enough for her to feel the warmth of another person. "I don't believe their story," he said simply. The next morning, she left bread on the table for him before going out to tend the coop. It was burned at the edges and lopsided, but she tried. Rhett ate every bite without comment. Days passed like paper drifting downstream, quiet, slow, carried by something neither of them named. Willa still hadn't told him everything. Not the worst of it. Not the part that twisted inside her like a nail in greenwood. But she was starting to breathe without bracing. One night, she woke from a dream she didn't want to remember and found herself in the hallway. Rhett was there too, standing barefoot near the stove, stoking the fire. She didn't ask why he was awake. He didn't ask her either. They just stood there in the amber light, watching the flames move like dancers with nowhere to go. After a long silence, she said, "I left something behind." He didn't look away from a fire. "What was it?" "My little girl," she whispered. The air stilled. She was his. The preacher's. "I wanted her more than anything. But when he died, they said I wasn't fit. That grief had made me unholy. His family, his mother, took her." Her voice cracked, but she kept speaking, even as the words cut her throat. "I told them what he did to me. Behind closed doors. How he'd pray 1 minute and beat the devil into me the next. They said I was possessed. That I'd poisoned their boy with witchcraft. Said the child needed righteous hands to raise her." She turned away then, ashamed not of what she'd lived through, but of how her voice still trembled when she spoke it aloud. "I only came with Martha because she said if I did, she'd tell me where my daughter was. I haven't seen her face since the funeral." Rhett didn't speak for a long while. The fire cracked once, sharp as a whip. Then, quietly, he said, "We'll find her." Willa turned toward him, stunned. "Why would you help me?" "Because you still stand," he said. "And that means something." She blinked, and the tears didn't fall. They just stayed there, gleaming like stars too proud to descend. "You're not afraid of what I might be?" He shook his head. "I'm only afraid of what you'll believe about yourself." Neither spoke again. But when she returned to her room, her breath came easier. In the morning, Rhett left a note by her coffee. "We ride at dawn." She stared at the words like they were a map out of the dark. Outside, the frost was already melting. The morning they rode into town together, the air had the brittle clarity of winter arriving too early. Frost laced the windows of the church and the railings of the mercantile. Willa sat straight in the wagon seat beside Rhett, wrapped in her worn shawl, the locket cold against her chest. She hadn't been to a Sunday gathering since the preacher's funeral, and even then, she hadn't stayed for the sermon. She felt the stairs before the wheels had even stopped. Rhett climbed down first, his limp pronounced from the chill, but his posture steady. He offered her his hand, not to lead her, but to steady her, like one might a skittish horse who didn't deserve a rope. Willa took it. The moment her boots touched the dirt, it felt like the wind held its breath. They walked up the church steps together. The crowd parted, not kindly, but with the reflex of people making room for their own discomfort. Tansy Bell whispered into another woman's ear, her mouth curling with practiced cruelty. Sheriff Lang stood near the doorway, arms crossed, eyes following every step they took. Inside, the pews creaked as folks shifted. They didn't greet her, didn't smile. One woman clutched her child's hand a little tighter when Willa passed. Rhett sat beside her, eyes forward. When the hymn began, he didn't sing. Neither did Willa. The preacher at the pulpit, a lean man with silver hair and a starched collar, hesitated before opening his Bible. "Let us remember," he began, "that redemption requires repentance, and repentance requires truth." Willa met his gaze without blinking. After the service, the crowd poured out like water, spilling from a cracked jar. Rhett kept close, not shielding her, just there. Present. Real. Martha Cale stood at the edge of the steps, wearing black gloves and a smirk. Her voice carried like a nail dropped on stone. "Some men pay for company. Others pay for silence." Rhett didn't flinch. "And some women sell their kin to buy themselves another Sunday dress." The air snapped cold. Martha's eyes narrowed. "You've always attracted filth," Rhett called her. "First your wife, now the widow. What's next? Digging up bodies to keep you warm?" Willa stepped forward then, voice clear despite the tightness in her throat. "You still think I owe you something, don't you?" Martha scoffed. "You owe decency to this town, and to the child you abandoned." Willa's hand trembled, but she didn't retreat. "You gave me away like a sack of flour and promised my daughter if I stayed quiet. I kept my end. You never kept yours." Gasps bloomed like weeds among the crowd. Sheriff Lang stepped forward, thumb hooked in his belt. "That true, Martha." But Martha only turned and stalked away, black skirts sweeping like thunderclouds across the ground. Later that evening, they returned to the ranch in silence. Rhett's hands were stiff on the reins, and Willa sat curled against the side of the wagon, her thoughts noisy with regret. "They think I'm a liar," she whispered. "They thought that before," Rhett replied. "The truth just gave them something to name it with." That night, someone threw a rock through their window. No note, no words, just the shattering sound of judgment aimed in silence. Rhett found the stone and placed it on the table. Didn't say a word about it. The next morning, old Otis came to visit, bringing nails and planks to board up the broken glass. "I heard what happened," he said, tapping in the nails with slow deliberation. "Place like this remembers sins that never happened, and forgets the kindness it once knew." Willa offered him tea. He took it, hands trembling slightly. "You're not what they say," he told her, without looking up. "You carry sorrow like a saddlebag, but you don't throw it at folks." She blinked back sudden heat behind her eyes. That week, Sheriff Lang returned, not as a warning, but as a presence. He stood on the porch one afternoon and told Rhett there were questions being asked by men in collars, churchmen with money and long memories. "They want to know why you're harboring a woman who claimed their preacher was unfit. They want you both quiet, out of sight." Rhett didn't raise his voice. "She's got a right to live, Lang." "I'm not saying she doesn't," the sheriff said. "I'm saying this town forgets slow and forgives slower." Willa stood in the doorway behind them. "Then let them remember me fully," she said. Let them know I'm not hiding. Rhett turned to her, something unreadable in his eyes. You don't have to fight them. I'm not, she said. I'm freeing myself. It wasn't strength that fueled her, not exactly. It was weariness that had finally curled into resolve. She couldn't outwalk shame, but she could stop letting it lead her. The next morning, she returned to town alone. She walked past the mercantile, past the saloon, straight to the church steps, where she stood until the preacher arrived to unlock the doors. I'd like to speak, she said. He blinked at her. What about? My daughter. And what your brother did. Inside, the church was empty, shadowed and cold. She stood in the aisle and told him everything. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She just spoke, one truth at a time, like she was placing stones across a river so others might cross. The preacher paled, said he didn't know, promised to inquire. She didn't believe him, but it didn't matter. The truth was no longer hers to carry alone. When she returned to the ranch, Rhett was waiting by the gate, arms folded, brow tense. You came back, he said. I told you, she answered. I'm done hiding. That night, as the wind scratched at the windows and the fire danced low, Rhett set 2 mugs on the table. I want to ask you something, he said. Willa looked up. If we find her, your girl, what then? I bring her home, she said. Not because I'm whole, but because I'm trying to be. He nodded slowly. Then we'll bring her home. In the quiet that followed, Willa reached out and laid her hand over his. Not as a promise, but as a moment earned. Outside, the stars blinked into life, one by one, as if bearing witness. The wind came in sharp off the ridgeline that morning, rattling the bare orchard branches like bones whispering to each other. Willa stood in the half-light with her coat pulled tight and Rhett's revolver heavy at her hip. She hadn't asked for the weapon, and Rhett hadn't offered it with any talk of danger. He had simply laid it beside her breakfast plate that morning, alongside a folded scrap of paper with an address written in thick, deliberate hand. The mission house sat an hour's ride east, past creek beds and forgotten mining scars, nestled into the rocks like a secret ashamed of itself. It was where her daughter had been taken, quietly, without petition, without kindness, as if love could be revoked by signature. The preacher's brother ran the place now, another man with holy titles and closed doors. They rode in silence. The trail narrowed as they climbed, and the horses kicked up red dust that clung to Willa's skirts like old blame. Rhett's jaw stayed clenched the entire way. She'd learned that silence from him, how to carry your anger like a stone you never set down, just learned to shape your spine around. The gates of the mission were wrought iron, flanked by 2 stone angels, weathered and chipped. Their wings were cracked, their eyes worn blank. No one greeted them. No one needed to. This wasn't a place that welcomed redemption. A boy answered the door, barely older than 12, cheeks raw from wind and chores. The Reverend's busy, he said. He'll see us, Rhett replied, voice low and flat. The boy hesitated, then vanished. Minutes passed. Willa ran her fingers over the locket hidden under her blouse, her heartbeat steady but slow, like hooves on packed snow. When the Reverend arrived, his face was pale and narrow, clean-shaven and tight-lipped. You've come for the girl, he said. No greeting, no question. I've come for my daughter, Willa answered. She belongs to God now. And the church, he said, without a trace of warmth. We were told you abandoned her, that you confessed to unnatural behavior, that you were a danger. I told the truth, Willa said, her voice calm. That your brother laid hands on me, that he hurt me and others, that your mother took my daughter to cover his sins. He did not flinch. Your lies don't serve you here. Rhett took a step forward, boots echoing against the stone. Do they serve a court? He asked, and pulled a leather-bound book from his saddlebag. He handed it to the Reverend with quiet force. His journal. The original. We found it behind the altar board at the church before they replaced it. Your brother wasn't much of a record keeper, but he liked to confess in private. The Reverend's face remained frozen for 3 seconds, then cracked, just slightly, at the mouth. He didn't open the book. Didn't have to. I'll call the girl, he said. Willa's knees threatened to betray her, but she stayed upright. She watched the hallway as footsteps came, small ones, hesitant. And then she saw her. A girl of 7, maybe 8. Pale hair, loose braids, eyes that belonged to Willa, and a mouth shaped like her father's, before it ever curled in cruelty. She looked up at the strangers and clung to the skirt of the woman escorting her. "She yours?" the Reverend asked dryly, almost mocking. Willa stepped forward. "She's mine." The child stared at her like one stares at a photograph, familiar, unreachable. Willa didn't cry. She knelt, slow and careful, and held out her hands. "My name is Willa," she said softly. "I used to sing to you at night. Your favorite was about the apple tree. Do you remember that?" The girl didn't answer, but her eyes widened. Rhett knelt beside Willa, reaching into his coat. He pulled out a tiny wooden horse, carved with care and time. "Your mama made the first one. This is the second." The child reached for it without speaking, her small fingers brushing Rhett's hand. The other woman made no move to stop her. "Can we take her?" Willa asked, voice barely audible. The Reverend folded his hands. "Technically, no. Not until the circuit judge reviews guardianship. But I think it's time the church let go of what doesn't belong to it." Willa rose, lips trembling but composed. "You don't own Grace," she said. "No," the Reverend replied. "But I know when I'm outmatched." They left the mission house with the child riding between them. She said little at first, only clutching the wooden horse to her chest and watching the sky like she'd never seen it without a ceiling. Rhett spoke gently now and then, naming the trees, pointing out where deer sometimes drank, telling her which clouds meant snow was coming. By the time they reached the ranch, she'd spoken her name aloud, Addie, and asked if she could sleep by the window. That night, Willa stayed up in a chair beside her daughter's bed. Rhett brought her tea, didn't speak, just set it beside her and left. Willa sat in the dark long after the child's breathing grew slow and steady. She whispered songs only half remembered. She kissed Addie's forehead with the quiet care of someone relearning how. Outside, the orchard caught fire. It started with a single tree, old and hollowed, struck perhaps by lightning or set ablaze by bitterness. No one saw who lit it. No one heard the match strike. But by the time the flames reached the second tree, the wind had already taken hold, and the sky was lit with orange fury. Rhett was the first to see it. He banged on the windows and shouted, "Fire in the orchard." Willa jolted awake and grabbed Addie, wrapping her in a quilt and rushing her toward the barn where it would be safest. Rhett, coat already on, ran for the water barrels. He started digging trenches, calling instructions without panic. Old Otis came from next door with his grandson and a shovel. Even Tansy Bell showed up, face pale, dress cinched, bringing buckets and curses and wet cloths. The town was still watching, but now they helped. The flames clawed high into the sky, eating years of memory and root. Willa joined the line without hesitation, passing buckets, wetting cloths, coughing through smoke. Her hair singed at the ends, her skirts blackened, but she stayed. By morning, the orchard was ruined, but the fire had not reached the house. Rhett stood with hands blackened and blistered, watching the final tree collapse into embers. Willa walked to him, face streaked with ash, lips cracked but proud. "Someone lit it," she said. He nodded. "Someone who wanted us gone." "But we're still here," she said. The sheriff arrived as the sun crested the hill, coat unbuttoned, his expression grim. "Found something out back," he told them. In his hand, he held a letter. It bore Martha Cale's handwriting. Inside, a confession, scrawled in haste and venom. She'd set the fire. She'd meant it as justice, as cleansing. The orchard, she wrote, was tainted. "She's gone," the sheriff added. "Left town last night. Likely for good." Rhett handed him the journal. "Send it with her name on it. Let the circuit court know we're not asking for pity. We're asking for truth." The sheriff nodded. "You'll get it." That evening, with the ashes still cooling, Rhett and Willa sat on the porch while Addie slept curled beneath a pile of quilts. "She won't remember everything," Rhett said. Willa looked out at the orchard's remains. "But she'll know she was chosen. By blood. By love." Rhett nodded. "That's the better kind." Willa turned to him then, eyes soft but steady. You ever think you'd get to have something whole again? No, he said. But I hoped. They didn't kiss. Didn't reach for hands. But they didn't need to. The fire hadn't taken what mattered. And in the soft quiet between them, something took root. That night, Rhett planted the first new tree. Willa helped pack the soil. Addie watched from the porch, the wooden horse tucked against her cheek. Some things bloom again, even after fire, even after shame. Especially then. And you, watching from afar, might think some lives are too ruined to start over. But I'll tell you this, what's been traded isn't always lost. Sometimes it's just waiting to be chosen again. By someone patient enough to listen. By someone kind enough to stay. If this story moved you, please let me know. Where are you listening from? I'd love to hear that, and also like, comment, and subscribe.